The first time I saw the 1914 studio portrait, I almost scrolled past it. Just another stiff black and white photograph from a time when no one seemed capable of smiling. A mother sits beside her small daughter, both dressed in heavy wool, both staring straight into the camera with that hollow, early-century stillness. Everything about it felt ordinary, almost forgettable, until I noticed the mother's right hand. At a glance it seemed gracefully folded across her lap, but something about the tension in her knuckles drew my eyes back. Her fingers were curled too tightly, the way someone might grip a secret they hoped the world would never notice. I leaned closer to the screen, then closer still, until my breath fogged the glass. There, just barely visible between her pale fingers, was the edge of something dark, too sharp to be fabric, too smooth to be a glove, and too deliberate to be accidental. The more I stared, the more I felt the strange sensation that I wasn't the one studying the photograph anymore. It was studying me. I could almost sense the air shift, the way it does before a storm or a whisper. The daughter's expression, frozen in time, seemed suddenly wrong, as if her gaze wasn't just vacant, but pleading. Shadows gathered at the corner of the room, bending toward the image like they recognized it. The mother's eyes, once lifeless grayscale, seemed to glint with something cold and knowing, as though she expected someone, after more than a century, to finally see what she had tried so desperately to hide. And in that moment, I felt an inexplicable urge to turn the photo away from me, to flip it down or shut it off, because the longer I looked, the stronger the impression became that whatever she was holding in her hand was never meant to be seen alive. The hidden grip in the 1914 studio portrait becomes the first quiet signal that something is deeply wrong, though at first glance it appears completely mundane. The kind of detail most people would skim past without a second thought. The mother in the photograph is sitting with the stiff, practiced composure common in early studio portraits, her posture rigid, her dress perfectly arranged, her gaze locked forward with the cold stillness of someone accustomed to the long exposure times of the era. Yet her right hand betrays her. The fingers are not posed delicately as one might expect from a portrait meant to appear dignified or composed. Instead, they seem clenched, pulling the skin tight over the knuckles, creating a tension that feels almost violent in contrast to the stillness of her face. This tension is the kind that comes from fear rather than poise, a tension that hints at the strain of holding something not merely physical but emotionally overwhelming. Her hand seems frozen in an act of concealment, hiding something with such determined intent that the gesture becomes louder than her expression. When the viewer leans in, the first details that reveal themselves are subtle enough to be dismissed as shadows or imperfections in the image. The lighting of old studio portraits often cast delicate gradients across clothing and skin, but here the shadows around her hand are too uniform, too purposeful, as if they are working to mask the shape hidden beneath her fingers. The dark edge peeking between her knuckles doesn't align with the folds of her dress, nor does it resemble the accessories common for women of that time. It is not lace, not ribbon, not fabric of any kind. It appears smooth, almost polished, as if made of something solid, something that doesn't belong in a casual pose. The more one studies it, the clearer it becomes that the mother's hand is not simply resting, it is restraining. Her thumb presses down with enough force to distort the shape of her palm, and her other fingers curl inward like a cage. This grip gains even more significance when contrasted with the rest of the photograph. The daughter sits beside her, her hands neatly placed, her expression vacant but not unusual for a child in early photography. Everything else in the image aligns with the conventions of the era, the stiff clothing, the unyielding posture, the somber expressions born from both cultural norms and long exposure requirements. The mother's hand, however, violates this uniformity. It introduces movement into a moment meant to be perfectly still, revealing the presence of something hidden beneath the imposed calm of the studio setting. The longer one looks at the image, the more it becomes impossible to ignore the way the mother's entire arm seems slightly off balance, as though she is fighting the urge to pull her hand away or shift its position, but knows she must keep it exactly where it is until the photograph is taken. Her expression, too, begins to take on new meaning. At first it appears simply blank, the typical numb gaze of early 20th century portraits. But once attention is drawn to her hand, her face transforms into something far more difficult to define. There is a rigidity around her eyes, a tension in the corners of her mouth, as though she is concentrating on maintaining control. The photograph captures a woman who is not merely posing for a portrait, she is containing something, suppressing it, holding it down both literally and emotionally. It becomes apparent that whatever lies in her grip is not just hidden from the camera but actively resisted. A small tilt of her wrist suggests weight, not physical heaviness but the oppressive kind that demands constant attention. The viewer begins to imagine the environment in which the photograph was taken. The studio would have been dimly lit, with heavy curtains filtering the daylight. The photographer, adjusting his equipment, would have instructed the mother to sit still, to hold her daughter close, to maintain the pose. But he likely never noticed the hand's odd tightness. Or perhaps he did and ignored it, dismissing it as a nervous habit or a quirk of personality. People in that era were accustomed to maintaining appearances even while carrying private burdens, and the mother may have expected that no one would ever notice the truth hidden in her hand. After all, photography then was not examined with the precision it is today. Prints were small, details blurred by the limitations of camera technology. She may have believed her grip would fade into the shadows, just another subtle imperfection lost to time. But time has turned against her. Modern scanning, digital enhancement, and the obsessive curiosity of those who study historical images have resurrected every forgotten detail. What she once hid within the grayscale folds of the portrait now stands exposed beneath the scrutiny of modern eyes. The dark object, whatever its nature, draws attention like a whisper that grows louder the longer it is ignored. It creates questions the photograph cannot answer. Why is she holding it so tightly? Why is it hidden? Why does her expression shift from blank to strained once you notice her hand? What was happening in that studio in 1914 that required such secretive force? The image gains a life of its own as the mind begins filling in the gaps, imagining possibilities that grow more unsettling with every glance. Perhaps the object is small and alive, struggling against her grip. Perhaps it is something once lost and now found, something she cannot bear to let go. Or perhaps it is something that should never have been touched at all. Each possibility reshapes the entire photograph, turning an ordinary portrait into a silent confession. The mother's hand becomes the focal point, the axis around which the entire unease of the story revolves, a physical manifestation of the secret she intended to take with her into obscurity, never expecting that one day someone would look closely enough to notice what she fought so desperately to conceal. The discovery of the photographer's journal begins not with an intentional search, but with an accidental stumble, the kind that feels harmless at first yet becomes the catalyst for everything that follows. The journal is found tucked inside a drawer of an antique cabinet that had been purchased at an estate sale, a piece of furniture coated in dust and carrying that faint, familiar scent of forgotten lives. Its drawers stick slightly, wooden edges swollen with age, and it is only through persistence and curiosity that the bottommost drawer finally gives way, revealing a thin, leather-bound book wrapped in a brittle cloth. The journal bears the name of the photographer whose faded signature is seen on the corner of the 1914 studio portrait, a name that once belonged to a man known for his quiet precision but lost to history in every other meaningful way. The handwriting on the cover is elegant yet hurried, as though he wrote it while glancing over his shoulder. When the journal is opened, the first few pages seem ordinary enough, appointments logged in neat lines, descriptions of families, workers, traveling performers, and soldiers who visited his studio before leaving for the front lines. But several entries later, the tone shifts abruptly. The writing becomes less organized, ink growing darker and more forceful, letters trembling with uneven strokes. It is here that the photographer begins recounting moments that trouble him, incidents that he initially tries to rationalize but gradually admits he cannot. He describes certain clients whose images refuse to appear correctly on the plates, their outlines distorted or their expression subtly altered by the time the photograph developed. He writes about shadows that lingered in places where no light should have allowed them and faces that seemed to shift when he turned away. He blames the chemicals at first, then the equipment, even the lighting, but none of his explanations hold for long. His unease becomes palpable as his entries take on a confessional tone. He describes nights when he could not sleep, tormented by the feeling that the images he captured were somehow aware of him. He notes that some portraits had to be taken multiple times because the subject's eyes appeared closed or misaligned, even though he distinctly remembered them staring straight ahead. He writes of moments when he swore he saw a flicker of movement in the reflection of his camera lens, something small and quick, like a gesture someone might make when they think no one is watching. The studio, once a place of creative work and livelihood, begins to feel like a trap to him. He mentions avoiding certain corners, especially near the shelves where unused plate negatives were stacked, because he felt watched whenever he lingered too long. The entry that mentions the mother and child from the 1914 portrait is brief but deeply unsettling. He recalls the mother's demeanor not as somber or reserved, as would be expected, but as strained, as though she were suppressing an emotion far stronger than the stiff composure required for long exposures. He notes that her eyes darted around the studio before the photograph was taken, particularly toward the door and the curtained window, as if fearing someone might interrupt. He writes that her right hand remained tightly clenched from the moment she entered, and he suspected she might have been hiding something, though he never saw what it was. When he asked her to relax her posture, she nodded politely but did not loosen her grip. More disturbing is his recollection of the child. He describes her expression as blank yet oddly focused, as though she wasn't looking at him but at something just behind him. Several times he turned, expecting to see someone standing there, but the space was always empty. During the long exposure, the child blinked, though he insisted that the exposure time should have frozen her eyelids in an open position. This anomaly unsettled him enough that he nearly asked the mother to reshoot the portrait, but her rigid, almost pleading expression kept him silent. He felt as though suggesting another photograph might break something fragile between them, something potentially dangerous. The journal then recounts his attempt to develop the plate. He writes about his hands trembling as he immersed the glass into the chemical bath, watching as the image slowly formed. At first everything appeared normal, but then he noticed a faint blur near the mother's lap, a distortion that didn't align with any known photographic error. He stared at it for several minutes, convinced it shifted while submerged. When he finally removed the plate and hung it to dry, he felt the undeniable sensation of something brushing against his arm, though he was completely alone in the darkroom. He dropped the plate in shock, narrowly saving it before it shattered, and fled the room without turning off the developing lamps. In later entries, the photographer's fear becomes more explicit. He states that certain portraits began to feel like traps, like moments caught in glass that refused to remain still. He writes that he started storing problematic photographs in a locked box, afraid that leaving them out might allow their strange influence to spread across the room. He mentions hearing faint tapping at night, as though someone were inside the studio brushing their fingers against the plates one by one. He tried to dismiss it as settling wood or small animals, but the tapping always followed the same rhythmic pattern, too deliberate to be accidental. What makes the journal even more chilling is its abrupt ending. The final entry stops mid-sentence, ink blotting the page as though his writing was interrupted by something immediate and unexpected. There is no signature, no explanation, no resolution. The remaining pages are blank, suggesting that he never returned to finish his thought, leaving readers to wonder whether he abandoned the journal out of fear or whether something happened to him in that silent, shadowed studio that prevented him from ever picking up the pen again. The moment the child's impossible blink reveals itself, everything that once felt like eerie curiosity shifts into something far more disturbing. Because photographs from 1914 were never meant to behave this way, never. Meant to give the impression of life subtly stirring beneath the grainy stillness. It begins with the decision to scan the portrait at a higher resolution, not out of suspicion at first but out of a desire to preserve it more clearly. As the digital image sharpens, the creases in the mother's dress appear more defined, the studio backdrop reveals its faint texture, and the child's small, solemn face becomes sharper than it has been in over a century. Yet with this clarity comes something else, something the viewer cannot immediately articulate. The child's eyes seem wrong, not in their shape or position but in the feeling they evoke. There is a focus in them that does not belong in a frozen photograph, as if her gaze is not fixed on the lens but on whoever is looking at her now, across decades and technology, across life and death. Her stare is too precise, too direct, as though she has become aware of the renewal of attention, aware that someone is studying her face again after so long. The viewer leans closer, adjusting brightness and contrast, expecting to find the comfort of photographic flaws, dust spots, scratches, or chemical blurs. But instead, the child's upper eyelid seems to shift subtly between two frames of digital enhancement, not enough to be dramatic, just enough to suggest the faintest movement. The difference is something only a person obsessed with details would notice, a narrowing or widening no more than a fraction of a millimeter, impossible for the human eye to consciously track yet unmistakable once seen. At first, the viewer assumes it must be a trick of the light, perhaps an effect caused by changing resolution settings or pixel interpolation. But trying to reproduce the inconsistency only makes it clearer that the blink does not align with any technical flaw. It feels intentional, like the child in the image blinked during a moment no one was watching. Once noticed, it becomes impossible to unsee. The slight shift between frames looks like a breath caught in stillness, a ghost of movement lingering where none should exist. The viewer tries to rationalize it, to anchor the image in the safe realm of technical errors, but the blink feels too organic, too smooth, too deliberate. It resembles the subtle motion the eye makes when adjusting focus, as if the child is trying to see more clearly the person observing her. The viewer begins comparing multiple zoomed-in captures, placing them side by side, and the differences grow even more unsettling. The reflection in her eyes appears marginally altered, as though the light source shifted angles, although the photograph was taken in a single moment more than a century ago. The shadows around her lashes change ever so slightly, like the faint tremble of a living eyelid hovering between open and closed. The unease intensifies when the viewer studies the child's expression more closely. Her small lips, once seemingly neutral, now appear to be pressed together with faint tension, and the curve of her jawline gives the impression of someone holding their breath. It is as though the child is caught between two states, the lifeless stillness of the photograph and the faint echo of life that refuses to be completely extinguished. The viewer notices that the longer they stare, the more the child seems to shift emotionally, transforming from blankness into something that resembles wariness, even fear. But fear of what? The photographer? The mother? Or perhaps the act of being seen again after such a long time? Every possibility feels worse than the last. The environment around the viewer begins to change too, though at first it is attributed to imagination. The room feels colder, quieter, as if the world is holding its breath. Shadows seem to gather behind the viewer, not nearing but waiting. The sensation of being watched grows stronger the more the child's eyes are studied. It is no longer just the unsettling notion that the image contains a blink, it is the creeping realization that the child seems aware of being observed, as though the barrier between viewer and photograph is thinner than expected. The viewer shifts their gaze away from the screen, but the feeling doesn't fade. Something about those eyes lingers in peripheral vision, a faint impression like the afterimage of staring into a bright light, except instead of light, it is the child's intent stare. The viewer returns to the picture, trying to calm themselves with logic. They compare the scan version with the original printed portrait. The print shows no sign of movement, as expected. The child's eyelids are firmly fixed, her expression unchanged. Yet the digital version continues to show that small, impossible difference, as though the stillness of the original is not strong enough to contain whatever is waking within the enhanced image. It is almost as if the act of magnification has breathed life into something dormant, a dormant flicker that needed attention to reawaken. Then comes the moment that deepens the disturbance from unease to dread. As the viewer scrolls across the mother's figure, eyes tracing her tense posture and tightly clenched hand, they return to the child in hopes of grounding themselves. But the child's eye seems slightly more open than before, not in the exaggerated way of horror or imagination, but in a subtle, natural shift that one might expect from a real child adjusting focus. The viewer blinks rapidly, unsure whether fatigue is altering perception. They refresh the image, reopen the file, restart their device, but the impression remains. The child looks more alert, more present. The stillness of the photograph has been broken in a way that cannot be undone. The viewer tries to escape the image, closing it and turning away, but the memory of the blink remains as vivid as if it had happened in real time. It creates questions that gnaw at the mind. Did the child blink during the original exposure? If she did, why does the printed version not show it? And if she did not, then what, exactly, is shifting in the scanned image? The viewer becomes acutely aware that something in the photograph has changed in response to being watched. Something noticed the attention. Something reacted. Something small, but impossibly alive, has moved in a place where nothing should move at all. The realization that the mother's hidden hand is clasping something disturbingly human does not arrive all at once but unfolds in layers, each more unsettling than the last, as the viewer begins to examine the image with an intensity fueled by equal parts curiosity and dread. The mother's hand, once merely clenched and mysterious, starts to reveal contours and shapes that do not align with anything inanimate. At first, it looks like she's pressing her fingers around a small, smooth object, something oval-shaped perhaps, but the more the image is enhanced and scrutinized, the clearer it becomes that the object has texture that no accessory or trinket from that time period would possess. It appears wrinkled, uneven, with soft creases that resemble the delicate folds of skin. The viewer feels a cold sensation wash through them as the thought forms slowly and unwillingly. This thing she is holding might not be an object at all but something alive or once alive. The shape becomes more defined when brightness and contrast are adjusted with precise, careful increments. What emerges between her knuckles is faint but unmistakable, a tiny, curled shape resembling the edge of a fingernail, impossibly small and slightly discolored. It is the kind of nail found on an infant, soft and barely formed, yet its outline is clear enough to send a jolt of nausea through the viewer. The mother's grip, once interpreted as possessive or secretive, now appears protective in a different, more sinister way, as if she is shielding something fragile, something not meant to be seen by the camera or by anyone else. The curvature of this small nail seems to respond to the pressure of her fingers, bending ever so slightly in a way that no rigid object could. The viewer zooms in further, heart thudding with a kind of involuntary fear that comes from realizing they have stumbled upon something they were never meant to uncover. Her fingers tell the rest of the story. The tension in her knuckles is not simply due to anxiety or stiffness, it is the tension of holding something that struggles or once struggled. The skin around her thumb appears strained, flattened as though pressed against a tiny form beneath it. The way her hand curves inward is too natural, too reflexive for someone gripping an object. It is the posture of someone restraining something small that might slip away if she loosens even slightly. The viewer tries to deny what they are seeing, tries to convince themselves it is a photographic artifact, a smudge, or an illusion caused by aging film, but the small human-like shape remains stubbornly present, refusing to vanish. The shadows around it do not distort but actually clarify the form, adding depth where the viewer does not want depth to exist. As the viewer stares, the mother's expression in the photograph gains new meaning, twisting from stoic neutrality into something more frantic beneath the surface. Her eyes no longer seem simply vacant, they look haunted, as if she had been carrying the weight of a terrible decision at the exact moment the shutter clicked. Her jaw appears tight, her lips pressed together in a thin line that hints at suppressed emotion, fear, desperation, maybe even guilt. The interpretation begins to shift, perhaps she is not hiding something from the world but protecting the world from something. Or perhaps she is protecting something from the world. Both possibilities create an entirely new narrative that wraps itself around the image, suffocating the viewer with its implications. The child beside her, initially the focus due to the impossible blink, now becomes secondary, almost eclipsed by whatever is concealed in the mother's hand. But the daughter's posture adds yet another layer of discomfort. Her small fingers rest stiffly on her lap, and her shoulders appear unusually rigid, as though she too is aware of what her mother is holding. There is no visible leaning toward or away from the mother, but her gaze, frozen, hollow, and ancient in its stillness, suggests she knows something is terribly wrong. The viewer begins to wonder whether the child is afraid, resigned, or simply beyond normal emotional reaction due to something that happened before the photograph was taken. The setting of the studio itself becomes more sinister under this new interpretation. The plain backdrop, once neutral and forgettable, now feels like a stage upon which something unspoken is being immortalized. The lighting, meant to capture facial features clearly, casts faint shadows that seem to emphasize the mother's grip even more dramatically. The photographer's positioning of the subject suddenly takes on darker weight, as though he unknowingly, or knowingly, captured the exact moment when a horrifying truth was frozen into permanence. Every small detail that once seemed insignificant begins to feel loaded with meaning. The slight tilt of the mother's wrist now appears calculated, the way someone might angle their hand to ensure the camera doesn't capture too much of what is inside it. The positioning of her dress seems arranged to minimize any bulging or shifting. Even the child's placement beside her seems intentional, as though the mother needed her near to maintain control or perhaps to keep something balanced in her grip. The viewer feels the uncomfortable sensation that the photograph is no longer a simple family portrait but a carefully staged effort to hide, preserve, or protect something monstrous or tragic. The horror intensifies when the viewer zooms out from the hand and takes in the entire composition of the portrait again. Everything seems to revolve around that clenched fist now, the stiffness of the shoulders, the forced stillness of the child, the tension etched subtly into the mother's face. Even the darkness of the mother's sleeve seems drawn toward the object, as if the shadows are bending around it. The human-like shape in her hand becomes the gravitational center of the entire photograph, a silent, horrifying presence that transforms the image from a relic of the past into something alive with secrets. The viewer cannot stop staring, held by a mix of fascination and dread, as though the photograph itself is urging them to see more, to understand more, to recognize that the mother's hidden grip contains a truth that should never have crossed the threshold of time yet somehow has. Waiting patiently for someone to notice what she tried so desperately to hide. The discovery of the final plate negative is what transforms the unsettling hints and subtle irregularities into undeniable evidence that the photograph contains far more than a frozen moment in time. The glass negative, long thought to be lost or destroyed, surfaces from an unexpected source, an archival box mislabeled and forgotten in the storage room of a small historical society. The curator, sorting through items destined for disposal, notices the photographer's name etched faintly along the edge of the fragile plate. The viewer, already deep into researching the mystery of the 1914 portrait, is contacted and invited to examine it. The moment the negative is held to the light, the world seems to tilt, as if the shadows captured in the glass have been waiting, patiently, silently, for the chance to step forward. Unlike the printed copy, the negative reveals details with brutal clarity. Every scratch, every stain, every grain of silver nitrate becomes a part of the truth it holds. When the viewer places it on a light box, the shapes that emerge are not softened by fading ink or the wear of years. The mother's expression appears sharper, more strained, her eyes reflecting a panic that the print seemed to dilute. The grip of her hand looks tighter now, the shadows within her fist appearing deeper and more defined, as though the object she holds is resisting her even in stillness. But the most disturbing revelation comes from the space just behind her shoulder, a place where the print showed nothing more than a darkness one could easily attribute to studio lighting. In the negative, however, that darkness has shape. It looks first like a smudge, an accidental blur caused by movement or mishandling. But as the viewer leans closer, dread blooms in the chest as the blur sharpens into a face. Not the mother's face, nor the child's, nor any reflection from the studio environment. It is smaller, slightly distorted, and disturbingly human in shape, a narrow jawline, hollow cheeks, and eye sockets darker than the surrounding shadows. Its features are not fully formed, as though the face is emerging from the darkness rather than existing within it, half manifested and suspended behind the mother like an apparition caught in the act of moving toward her. The viewer's breath falters as the realization hits, the face is not posing, not captured in a moment of stillness, but pressing forward, leaning out from the shadows with a hunger that feels almost physical. The unsettling presence of this face recontextualizes everything already observed in the photograph. The mother's tight grip, her strained expression, the child's unnatural stillness, even the photographer's fearful journal entries, all of it converges around the idea that something else was in that studio. The viewer imagines the room as it must have been over a century ago, dimly lit, heavy curtains muting the afternoon light, the photographer nervously adjusting his equipment while the mother sits rigidly in her place, praying perhaps that the exposure would finish quickly before whatever lurked behind her became visible. The negative reveals what the human eye did not or could not perceive in that moment, as if the camera captured a layer of reality shielded from ordinary sight. Then there is the object in the mother's hand. In the print, it looked like a small, ambiguous form with hints of human-like texture. But the negative shows it with unsettling clarity. The tiny fingers, curled and slightly contorted, appear distinctly separate from the mother's own hand. They are not clutching her but rather being clutched by her. The small hand in her grip is limp, with a softness that suggests it is neither fully alive nor entirely absent. The faint glow around it, caused by the contrast of chemical exposure on the plate, makes it seem as though it is reacting to the viewer's gaze, brightening slightly as the negative is exposed to light, almost like a warning or a plea. As the viewer studies the object, the creeping horror intensifies when they notice that the small hand is turned inward, its tiny nails pressing into the mother's palm, as though it once attempted to resist, to pull away, or to cling. The mother's grip, once ambiguous, now appears desperate, even frantic, as if she is trying to restrain something that should not be free. The child beside her, when seen from the perspective of the plate negative, seems eerily aware of the presence behind her mother and the object being held. Her eyes, though still frozen, reflect a faint glimmer of fear that the print had concealed. The presence behind the mother, the faint hand in her grip, and the child's fixed expression come together like pieces of a puzzle design never to be assembled. But the most chilling detail of all lies near the bottom corner of the negative. There is a faint, nearly translucent shape, something like an imprint left by the movement of a small limb. It is as though a thin, fragile arm was once reaching outward, but the long exposure and the mother's desperate grip blurred it just enough to make it seem ghost-like. This trace suggests not only that the object in her hand was part of something larger, but that it was taken or held against its will. The viewer sits frozen, unable to look away from the negative. The more time they spend studying it, the more it feels as though the face behind the mother becomes sharper, as if focusing in response to attention. The shadows around the object in her hand seem to deepen. The entire image feels alive, not in a supernatural way that leaps from the frame, but in a subtle, insidious manner that suggests the moment captured is not fully contained. The negative holds layers of a truth that had been masked by the printed photograph, a truth that was never meant to be seen, perhaps never meant to resurface after the photographer locked his unsettling plates away. Yet here it is, glowing faintly under the light, its secrets exposed, its shadows shifting gently as though the act of being looked at has allowed something within it to stir once more. The final moments of the story unfold as the weight of every secret, every whisper of fear, and every unanswered question gathers into one last, unbearable truth. The house that once felt like a maze of shadows now stands silent, holding its breath as if aware that its final act is about to be revealed. The air feels thicker than before, heavy with the memories of the past that have been trying to claw their way into the present. Each room carries the echo of footsteps that do not belong to the living, and each door that creaks seems to open on its own as though inviting one more glance into the darkness. The protagonist moves through the corridor slowly, feeling the cold press against their skin, as if unseen fingers are brushing across them with a warning they cannot interpret. The lamp flickers, dimming with every step forward, casting a trembling circle of light that barely reaches the peeling walls. The ground beneath them feels uneven, warped by time and by something far older than the house itself. There is a soft sound, like breathing, coming from the end of the hall, but it is not the kind of sound that belongs to any human. It is low, strained, and hungry, as though it has been waiting for years to be acknowledged. The protagonist's heartbeat quickens as they realize that the presence they had felt since the beginning has finally stopped hiding. The door at the end of the hall stands slightly open, a faint glow seeping from inside, but the glow is wrong, too cold and too pale to be made by any normal light. They hesitate for a moment, knowing that once they step inside, everything will change, yet the pull is irresistible, almost like the house itself is guiding them to the place where all answers lie. When they finally push the door open, the room inside appears frozen in time, untouched and undisturbed, except for a figure standing by the window with its back turned. The chill deepens as the figure slowly turns, revealing a face that is familiar yet twisted by something that doesn't belong in the world of the living. Eyes hollow and wide, reflecting a depth of agony that makes the protagonist's breath stop, lips moving without sound at first before forming words that seem to scrape their way into existence. The truth spills out in pieces, like broken shards of a memory that had been buried beneath layers of fear and denial. The figure speaks of betrayal, of a night filled with screams swallowed by the wind, of a promise that was never kept and a life taken before it ever had a chance to begin. The darkness in the room thickens as the figure steps closer, its form flickering like a dying flame, as though torn between worlds. The protagonist feels the past crash into the present, drowning them with images that were never theirs but now burn inside their mind with unbearable clarity. The walls tremble as the story unfolds, the house reacting as though reliving the pain it had witnessed long ago. The shadows twist upward, stretching toward the ceiling, curling and writhing like living things desperate to escape. The protagonist struggles to breathe, their body feeling numb as the truth settles into them, rooting itself deeper than memory. The figure reaches out, not with malice but with a sorrow so profound it seems to echo through the very foundation of the house. The touch is cold but not harmful, a final plea for acknowledgement. The protagonist realizes that the only way to free the restless presence is to accept the truth and face what others ran from. As they whisper the words that the figure needs to hear, the air shifts, the cold lifting slowly as though dawn is breaking after a long night. The figure's expression softens, the agony easing from its face, its form beginning to dissolve into faint, drifting light. The house releases a long, aching sigh, its grip loosening as though relieved at last. The floor stops groaning, the walls settle, and the oppressive darkness thins into a quiet calm. When the final trace of the figure disappears, the protagonist stands alone in the now still room, the silence no longer threatening but peaceful in a strange, heavy way. Stepping out into the hallway, they feel the house watching them one last time, not with malice but with gratitude. As they reach the front door, the cold night air feels warmer than before, the world outside untouched by the horrors hidden within. The door closes softly behind them, and for the first time since stepping inside, the weight lifts from their chest. Yet even as they walk away, a lingering feeling follows, a knowledge that the house will always remember, that some stories never truly end, and that the darkness within its walls will sleep, but only until the next person hears its call.